Hello guys, welcome to Acquiring Movement Skills screencast on arousal theories. Last lesson we looked at drive theory and we looked at that concept of like the positive correlation or linear relationship between arousal and performance. So we basically looked at that drive theory saying that as arousal increases, so does performance of the dominant response. We talked about that term dominant response and how that would dictate whether the performance levels of autonomous and cognitive performers, and then we looked at the types of skills that will kind of that were explained effectively by the drive theory, but the types of skills that were also explained ineffectively. The key criticism we looked at the end of it was kind of the fact that the drive theory shows this kind of positive correlation, and it basically saying that if you're an autonomous performer performing gross skills, no matter how highly aroused you are, you're always going to perform well. Now we said there was a criticism of that because of the fact that kind of, you know, sometimes David Beckham will miss a free kick, sometimes Johnny Wilkinson will miss a conversion. Okay, why do they do that? And the reason why is because we didn't, or this theory, and the key criticism to the theory is this theory does not take into account over arousal. So what we need to do now is move on to the next theory, which is the inverted U theory. So the inverted U theory of arousal, okay, is basically exactly what it looks like there. Okay, upside down U, but inverted sounds a little bit more academic, so I'm sure that's what they called it. So as you see then, the difference is we are now no longer going with a line straight up here that's linear. We're now saying that as arousal increases, so does performance, but only up to an optimal midpoint. Okay, so you've got this point here and here. So if you continue, if arousal continues to rise, this will lead to a decrease or a gradual decrease in performance, as you can see down here. So as you're going up, as you're going up, as you're going up, good, perfect, and once you get past optimal arousal, if arousal continues to rise, performance will start to decrease. Okay, so that's your kind of key focus. That's the kind of the nuts and bolts behind the theory. That's your explanatory sentence. Now what we need to be able to do is kind of give an example, and the example needs to be based around 3 levels of arousal. Now when we're talking about this, we need to be able to say, right, if you have low levels of arousal, that means that you'll have an attentional field that is too wide. Now what does that mean? That basically means that when you're daydreaming, for example in a class, if I shout your name because you're not concentrating, what happens is because you have really low arousal levels, that physiological and psychological activation, and you're daydreaming, you're looking out the window, if I shout your name, at that point you're taking in things you should not be taking in. You're not looking at the whiteboard, okay, your attentional field widens and you start to take in stuff that you shouldn't be. Someone walking past the classroom on the way out, something on the wall, someone else talking in the classroom, and that concept of having lots of information coming in is called information overload. Now the other level of arousal, which is at this end, okay, is over arousal. Now when you're over aroused, this is when you're really over pumped up, okay, your attentional field narrows, and it's that point where you're really stressed, and you'll have felt it before. You're stressed, that you're looking for something and you're so stressed you just can't see it, and that concept of kind of being really stressed has a name. So firstly your attentional field narrows because you over focus on one cue, and then it leads to a psychological condition called hypervigilance, and it can lead to you making illogical decisions. So for example, it might lead you to lashing out, making a tackle in sport, etc. So going on from there, last one is the middle bit. So let's talk about this optimal arousal, the middle arousal point. So it's basically saying that when you're in that optimal arousal at a midpoint, the attentional field is at the ideal width. It's perfect, and this allows you to have ideal or perfect selective attention. And remember, selective attention is that concept of disregarding irrelevant stimuli and focusing or filtering the relevant stimuli. If I put this all into an example, if you're going to put an EG next to each of these, so if your attentional field widens excessively, we're going to use a goalkeeper in football. Okay, so a goalkeeper in football, if their attentional field widens, they miss the ball on a cross. Over arousal, okay, when they catch the ball and then drop it because of hypervigilance, because they're over focusing on the individual cue. And then finally we've got optimal or moderate arousal. This is where your attentional field is the ideal width and the goalkeeper will watch the ball and catch it into his hands. Okay, so that's the kind of key example we're going to use: low arousal, over arousal, optimal arousal, or moderate arousal. You just need to talk about attentional field width. Changes 3 ways, okay, one's ideal, one's wide, one's narrow, okay, and then we need to be able to try and add an example onto that linked to a goalkeeper in football. So that will give you about 2-3 lines worth of stuff in the exam, but there is something else you need to look at, because it's too simplistic to say that optimal arousal is always at a midpoint. If we remember the stuff we talked about last lesson, we looked at ability or stages of learning, autonomous and cognitive. Some people perform better at high arousal, other people perform better at low arousal. Some skills will perform better at high arousal, other skills will perform better at low arousal. So if I move on from that, that's the kind of evaluation point that we'll have a look at in the lesson. Your focus is just to get those key bits we've talked about there. Okay, so the theory that we're going to move on to, the second part of the lesson, is a catastrophe. And it's kind of a continuation of the inverted U theory. And if you have a look at it, basically you might want to draw this into your Cordell notes. It's basically saying that as arousal increases, so too does performance to optimal midpoint. Now when you get to this kind of optimal midpoint, then when you become over aroused, there is an extreme decline in performance. You can see this line where it's an absolute catastrophe. It's when performance absolutely goes off the rails. Okay, it's when Luis Suarez bites someone. Okay, it's when somebody goes in for a two-footed tackle and completely loses their head. This theory kind of says, look, there's no gradual decline in performance. It's an absolute disaster or catastrophe. And in order to get the exam terms for this, you need to talk about extreme decline. Now, the difference between this theory and any other theory that we've looked at for arousal is that it's unique. It's unique in the way it's multidimensional. It's multidimensional because it explores the concept of cognitive arousal and somatic arousal, where the others are based on just somatic arousal. So what it's saying then is that cognitive arousal is anything to do with your brain, so it's psychological worry or fear, whereas somatic arousal is body-based, physiological. So for example, when you have to take a penalty, your heart rate starts to go faster, your breathing rate increases. So if I said to you now, kind of, that's my talk, that's my introduction. I don't want to have to do that in tomorrow's lesson, so I've done it now. What I need you to do is to understand. So this is the picture. You might want to draw this so you can then make notes further on from here. So I'll put it back up here so you can see the point. This is how you get your marks when talking about the catastrophe theory. So it's exactly the same for your first point as the inverted U. As arousal increases, so does performance up to an optimal point or an optimal midpoint. However, if arousal gets too high, in this theory, it doesn't say there's a gradual decline, it says there's an extreme decline. And the extreme decline is caused by like a clash or interaction or a clash, I would say, of high cognitive arousal and high somatic arousal. So to put that into context, you go up, you're taking a putt on the final green, okay, you're taking a penalty in a World Cup final, you've got that weight, that horrible weight where you're waiting to take it. That leads you to start thinking and worrying about missing. When you start to worry about missing, that is cognitive arousal, and if that gets high, okay, on its own, that's fine. But if you also have a really high heart rate, breathing rate, as well as worrying about missing and fear of failure, those two coinciding at a high level cause an absolute crash in performance. That's called a catastrophe. It's described, because you can't say obviously catastrophe twice because that would be in your point that you're explaining. You've got to call it an extreme decline in performance. So that is the key focus. What we'll have a look at is the effect that has on performance after. So okay, if we do have this crash, and then you have a catastrophe or an extreme decline in performance, how does that affect your brain? How does it affect your brain and your body when you're performing? That'll be tomorrow's lesson. Can you make sure anything that's bullet pointed is in? Okay, I've kept those 2 points there because they are the thing that makes it multidimensional, because we're considering more than one type of arousal. Okay, thank you.